It is my pleasure to introduce my friend, Wilhelmina Hein. Tonight she is going to speak on pastoral counselors' experience in healing justice work from the point of view of a transgender pastor. Wilhelmina holds a Master's of Education degree from the University of Canterbury, New Zealand, with majors in cross-cultural studies and adult learning and development. She earned her Master's of Science degree in psychology from California Coast University and her Bachelor of Arts degree in social sciences from Massey University in New Zealand. She has had extensive international pastoral and communication work in Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, the United Kingdom as well, and has many years of experience in full-time pastoral work for parishes around the world, including Charleston, South Carolina, Melbourne, Australia, and Toledo, Ohio. She was pastor for Toledo's Good Samaritan Metropolitan Community Church from 1997 to 1999, and that's where I got to know Wilhelmina very well. And she is currently working on her Doctor of Theology dissertation there in the Netherlands, where she is today. So with that, I will give you Wilhelmina Hein.
Richard, thank you. So, hi everyone, whoever is listening. It is your time, I think, probably around 5:30 in the afternoon, and here it is just before midnight. So, but I want to share with you some of my thoughts and experiences, both as a transgender client in various situations in various countries, and as a pastor and pastoral counsellor who has on many occasions specifically dealt with people who are in the process of getting towards surgery, or transgender people, or people dealing with gender identity issues. So I thought what I might do is to speak for about 20 minutes to half an hour, and then leave the opportunity for people who are online to be able to ask questions from me. I am transgendered. I would say now I would call myself an old tranny. I'm 74 going on 75. And thus I've also been a client both pre and post-operatively over many years in several systems in various countries. I worked as an open trans person for the federal government in Australia for many years. And I've worked in pastoral counselling as a professional, both with setting up and running and participating in an organisation in the 1980s called Transcare in Australia, and as Richard said, as pastor in Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. And in a number of those places, I've been also specifically involved in pastoral care, medical care, counselling care, and advocacy for transgender people. I'm now retired, and I live in the Netherlands, back in the county in which I was born, and I've been here since late 2006. I want to share with you some of my own personal experiences about how I discovered who I was and what my identity really was. I grew up in a family in the Netherlands, and when I was 10, we immigrated to Australia. My father was very strictly religious. My mother was not. But if you're talking about a family in the 1950s, the father was very, very dominant. And so we had a very strong and strict religious influence in my upbringing. I discovered at a fairly young age that certainly I liked boys, but then became confused about my identity. Was I gay? The word transgender didn't appear at that time. The word transsexual was bandied around, but in Australia, and I'm now talking about the 1960s, in Australia, the people who were seen to be transsexual were either drag queens or prostitutes. And then suddenly, in the early 1970s, a famous British author who died last year called Jane Morris wrote a book called Conundrum. I really encourage you to read that for somebody's personal experience about coming out as a transgender person who was also married. And my experience was also that in 1970, I married in a very strict religious environment because the understanding and the doctrinal statements were that to, as a man, have sex with men was dreadfully sinful, and to be able to think about changing your sex to live in a different kind of anatomical body was also considered very sinful, and the way to fix this was to get married. So I married, I had a son, and in the third or fourth year of my marriage, I discovered that book by Jane Morris, and suddenly everything fell into place, that I realized that I was transgender. I remember back when I was very young in Australia, that when my mother was out, I would have two outfits from hers that I would try on. One was a horrible old maternity dress, and the other one was a gorgeous black and white cocktail frock. And I used to love walking around in that as long as I knew that there was nobody else home. So I left my marriage and sought a place where I could develop who I was, and found a transgender surgery program in Melbourne, Australia. I lived in Adelaide, Australia, and I used to have to travel 800 miles for appointments, no, 500 miles for appointments to Melbourne pretty regularly. Fortunately, with my federal government job, I was financially fairly well off, and even with having to pay alimony and everything, that worked very well. My experience with that institution in Melbourne was one that was very unusual. There was a very strong gatekeeper principle, and whatever was decided in that institution by the medical and psychiatric staff is something that you simply had to adhere to. For me, the decision was ultimately, the suggestion was that I would really have to leave my job, and that I would have to move interstate and find another job in my new persona even before surgery. I challenged that and ultimately won that challenge to be able to stay in my very well-paid federal government job, and actually changed on the job and was one of the first transgender people in Australia to be able to change on the job and keep their job. The federal government was very free and open with that. So I became involved in the gay community, the gay and lesbian community, because there was no other place for transgender people to go. We were all simply just one bunch. And through that process, and because of my religious upbringing and my feeling that I really wanted to help people, I ended up going to theology school and ultimately joined Metropolitan Community Church, and ultimately there became licensed, and then at a later stage in the 1970s ordained for pastoral ministry. But what did that mean for me as a transgender person? I was in a program that was very, very, I don't say dictatorial, but it was very very strict, and at the same time was a place where you did not have much movement room. What happened in that program for me personally was that at one stage, the professor running that program, who was a psychiatrist, apparently got another job, and in that process, and the agreement was it was a Catholic university job, that he had to leave his clientele behind, and there was no a constructive handover of clients to other people. When finally I heard from that institution after many requests, I found that there was a new coordinating psychiatrist who ultimately planned for my surgery in Melbourne. And by that time, because the surgery was still considered elective, the surgery took place in the surgical unit of the State Psychiatric Hospital. I used to joke that I was probably one of the few people who entered that hospital being found sane enough to be able to go on with the program. I was admitted and later that day discovered that there had been some medical mix-ups. The plastic surgeon was not booked, and with no counselling and no therapeutic process, I was sent back home to Adelaide, where I fell apart. For me, that was a very devastating time, and I decided that maybe this is something, and here came my strict religious upbringing. Even though I had moved out of that, it sits in your head. And I thought, does God want me to do this? Is this what I'm supposed to be doing? And so I stopped with a hormone program. There was no other program at the moment to go to in terms of transgender surgery. And I realized that I was beginning to live a very unsatisfactory life. For several years, I lived within the gay community, but lived as a very unhappy man who said that he was gay, but looked very much like on her way to being a woman. And I realized that one of the important things for transgender people is once you discover who you are, or once you discover who you ought to be, there is such an incredible drive, and you can try to wind your way through that, but ultimately the drive to be who you are will win out. At that time, in the mid-1980s, I wrote a poem that I want to share with you. It's called Yet Again. Yet again I fool myself. Heavy eyebrows, dark beard, attempts at mustachio. Yet the questions, how would these earrings look? The feel of the material, the cut of the cloth, the price, and whether I would need matching shoes. Yet again I'm fooling myself. For through the cacophony of macho music, I don't really feel at home in Gayola City. Is my tummy too big? Do I need a larger size of dress? And when will this diet take effect? Yet again, I'm fooling myself. For in the process of examination, I would still gladly find a scalpel, a knife, anything, and fashion according to longing, anything in me that plays discordant notes. That last idea of fashioning according to longing came out of Jan Morris's book when she talked about her experience of going to Casablanca for surgery and finding there transgender people from all over the world who were all looking to fashion according to longing their inner drive, who they were supposed to be. My Australian experience continued in the later half of the 1980s by going back and finding another clinic in Melbourne again at another major academic hospital. And I began in that clinic again as a client and had to actually start all over again. But in the process of being in that clinic, and they were much more conciliatory than the previous clinic, I discovered that I really was not happy with myself. I was not happy living in Australia, and I decided to move to New Zealand for a period of time. There was free travel between Australia and New Zealand. We could work in each other's countries, have residency in each other's countries. And for approximately 4 years, I lived and worked in New Zealand in both genders. Periodically, I had a job as a man. Then I would have a gay relationship. Then I realized that this was not what I wanted, and I went to work as a woman again. Ultimately, after a period of 4 years, I returned to Australia at the end of the 1980s because my father was extremely ill and ended up having open heart surgery, and I felt a very strong family connection and need to go back. I went back to work in the federal government, but in a sense continued to work as, I guess, a gay man who looked a little strange. And I did no more in Australia around the whole issue of looking at transgender surgery. I tried to push that behind me. In the early 1990s, I returned to New Zealand to work and to live in the city of Christchurch in the South Island. And there in 1993, I discovered that there was a private clinic undertaking gender reassignment surgery. I began the process of seeing the plastic surgeons, the colorectal surgeons, and it was recommended that I do some therapeutic work, which I subsequently did for about 1.5 to 2 years with a psychiatrist and a psychotherapist. And that was immensely helpful to me because it wasn't just about getting to surgery, it was about making sure that I was a whole person and that whatever happened, I knew very clearly what I wanted. If the possibility was there to get it, fine, and if not, were there opportunities for me to simply live as I was pre-operatively. I had the very great fortune of having a very good job for a period of time, having good health insurance, and in the mid-1990s, I had surgery in New Zealand in a private clinic with wonderful health care, wonderful aftercare, wonderful professional people, and a very good place to live and be able to transition totally into a new life. I undertook my master's degree there in education, and continued to do part-time pastoral work with both a metropolitan community church, small community, and work with the Anglican parish there, the Episcopal parish in New Zealand, where we used to hold our church services and undertook general pastoral work with them, with elderly people. In 1997, I had the opportunity of coming to the United States, and I lived in Toledo for those 2 years. There I experienced some issues. I had some breast problem issues, and when I went to see doctors, it always came back to, if you're having problems or you're feeling depressed, it must be to do with your being transgendered. I had no major interventions in New Zealand, but I constantly felt that the issue of being transgendered was one of the most important issues for the medical professionals with whom I dealt, but it wasn't for me. Sometimes I experienced depression because of sometimes very difficult situations in a pastoral setting. I experienced depression because I realized how increasingly difficult it was to develop a relationship with anybody, because anyone who looked at somebody who was transgendered, and at that time the word transsexual was still very much used, was looking at the sex in the word transsexual and really not wanting to develop the quality of a relationship. And so I chose for the option to occasionally date but not develop a relationship at all. I went back after the 2 years to New Zealand and lived in New Zealand for a while, and then came back in 2000 to the United States and spent 6 years in Charleston, South Carolina. I've got to say that in Charleston, South Carolina, the issue of my being transgendered was not an issue that came up for any health reasons. For the first probably 4.5 to 5 years in Charleston, I had a very healthy lifestyle until I realized that one morning I woke up and I was having a heart attack. And from that until I left in 2006, late 2006, I had wonderful cardiological care and wonderful hospital care, but it was very expensive care. And at the end of 2006, with also some personal spiritual developments and a different journey that I was moving on, I chose to come to the Netherlands, which was my ultimate goal in retirement, but now retirement was looming just a little earlier. In the Netherlands since 2006, I have been a client in the National Gender Unit. There is a national gender unit here in Amsterdam that has surgical facilities in 3 or 4 different places in the Netherlands. But even post-operatively, transgender people are taken care of by having a biennial medical checkup and ensuring that everything is still fine. We do blood work, everything happens. And I am in that system as someone who feels that they are very well taken care of in a total healthcare situation. It is totally covered by my health insurance. Everyone in the Netherlands is required to have health insurance. And the interesting thing in the Netherlands is that last year, the government passed legislation whereby they apologized for the fact that for a long, long time, when first in 1985 legislation was passed that enabled transgendered people to legally change their sex on their birth certificates, you were required to have had surgery that stopped you from procreating. And last year, the government apologized for that and provided for every transgendered person who since 1985 underwent that legal system compensation. And so that compensation applies for all the people in the Netherlands who have had surgery since 1985 until a couple of years ago. Let me talk a little about my experience in pastoral care as a pastor. I discovered as a pastor and pastoral counsellor and an advocate for transgendered people that the attitude of professional people that transgendered people deal with varied tremendously and brought me back to my early experiences as a client in Australia. Sometimes professionals feel that they have the right to be the gatekeepers. Now, a lot has changed since I discovered who I was and in the last 30 to 40 years. But one of the things that I've discovered is very, very important, and I had to focus myself on that as a professional caregiver, is that I cannot prejudge transgender people that come to me because everyone is different. Clients are searching for help, and sometimes that help is not always available. So there needs to be a professional process that runs from providing medical care, including maybe hormone therapy, right through to good mental health care. I encourage professional people to not be dishonest about what they can offer transgender people. I think that when transgender people are confronted with someone who tries to bluff their way through what they can offer, it does great harm to the person in the long run. And it is vital that when people deal with someone who is transgender, that they also provide a sense of care that enables that person to know what are this professional person's limits, what can I count on, and what can I not experience in these professional encounters. Be very, very careful if you're dealing with transgender people and you're having to deal with other professionals who work with them, that you are not encountering gatekeepers. one of my experiences in pastoral life and as a pastoral caregiver, especially in the United States of America, was to encounter transgendered people who had gone to counselors, who had a very strict or evangelical upbringing, perhaps evangelical life, and their professional experience was very much colored and flavored by their religious experiences themselves, and that became sometimes power processes that were very, very damaging to people. In healing justice work, which was also a part of the title, is that I believe as a pastoral counselor that one needs to work with the whole person. As a pastoral counselor, there are some things I can do. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a registered psychologist. I'm a pastoral counselor. But I can walk with people and find places and spaces for a client to enable them to provide a whole range of care, to empower them to become and remain a whole person. I think it's vital for caregivers and professionals to understand the differences that every person comes with, their background, their environment, their economic situation, their race, their social situation, their family situation, and all the baggage they come with needs to be explored in the process of finding who this person is and how we can best help them. It's important to check what you can offer, what is real, and what are your limits as a professional. I think I'm going to kind of leave it there, and it might be handy if people have questions that I begin by answering those.
So, well, I guess one of the questions that I will ask is, you shared a little bit about the differences in the care in the United States compared to the care that you received either in New Zealand or Australia, but then now your holistic care that you're getting in the Netherlands. You know, I know that for our clinic, we're treating people with HIV, and I know that you've counseled people with HIV before.
Yeah.
What are the major differences that you see in the healthcare systems between here in the U.S. and where you are, now, federally supported programs?
Yeah, I'm not sure how that works with HIV here. The HIV has simply here become a portion of medical care, and so I have not a clear idea of how that works in terms of someone who is transgendered with HIV, or are you talking about everyone with HIV, Richard?
Well, what's kind of specifically asking, related to anyone with HIV there.
Yeah.
And then
Okay. Yeah.
I know that, here we are trying to really push the fact of getting HIV care and testing and referrals back to our Ryan White programs in the context of medical care when someone's going to see their primary care physician, just, a part of the normal care throughout someone's life.
Yeah. I think my previous experience, and of course I've been out of the States for a long time, is that one of the dilemmas is that care in the United States, in a sense, is still so highly privatized sometimes, and therefore I think also expensive. In the Netherlands, that kind of care is simply part of the whole general health package that occurs in the medical system here. And so somebody with HIV simply goes through the whole program of seeing their physician, getting referred to specialized clinics or specialists in the hospital setting, and simply become a client who happens to have HIV, very much as me as a client who happens to have a heart condition. Does that make kind of sense, that it has become, yeah, ordinary is not a good word, but it has simply become so ordinary here. It's not pulled out as something very special.
So it's more of like a referral to a specialist
Yeah.
for that specific care than
Yeah.
it is. Okay.
Yeah, here usually it is, if somebody is not well, they have their own physician, their own doctor, and that doctor always refers. And so they are always referred to specialist care after that.
And you did speak a little bit about when you were here, how your care in Toledo was mostly, anything that was going on, your doctor tried to link it to your transgender.
My transgender status, yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So, and I think, once you're in a situation of, firstly, I think at that time that was my first health experience in America, my first experience with healthcare in America, and you're kind of stuck in a situation where I always felt more vulnerable in that situation to be able to challenge, this is not an issue about my being transgender. I'm very, very happy that I've had surgery and I'm very comfortable with who I am in my new body. So don't lay everything on the transgender issue if I'm feeling depressed or if I'm unwell. Feeling unwell, having a medical situation of some sort, like a very nasty flu or something else, is not related to who I am as a transgender person. It's simply related to who I am as a person.
Yes, and that makes more sense.
Yeah.
So anyone else with comment or question?
I'll jump in with a question. I'm just wondering, as you've been through different countries and seen the progression and changes that society has made in their views, like you said, transgender wasn't even a word.
Yeah.
What would you, does it give you hope to see the changes, and what kind of changes have you seen? And would you say the Netherlands is kind of the shining example that other societies can kind of lean in to?
Yeah, I think that is a twofold question. Firstly, my own experience when I began, and in certainly those first decades of my experience of transgender life, it was either or. If you said that you were transgender, it meant you were moving towards surgery. And I think we simply assumed that was very normal. And what has happened over the years is that that the whole issue of gender, of course, is much more fluid now. It's not either or, but it is maybe somewhere in between. And I have especially discovered that the last years in the Netherlands, for example, that gender has developed a fluidity here in the Netherlands that sometimes as an old transgender person, I think, oh, honey, we're going a little overboard with this now, you know. And so for me, there are still moments, and I find myself surprising myself with that, that I am, I won't say distressed, but a little confused that people are saying, well, I'm transgender and I want to have, I was anatomically born a male, but now I want to be female on my birth certificate, but I'm not having any surgery towards that. And so there is that kind of fluidity happening in the Netherlands, and legally you can do that now in the Netherlands. But I guess I'm just old. and part of me says that I don't quite understand some of that, but at the same time, I believe that that is certainly something that continues to need to be explored, because we're constantly exploring the whole issue of what it means to have maleness or femaleness, what it means to be gendered in any way whatsoever. And in that sense, James, yes, I agree. I think that the Netherlands is certainly a shining example in terms of openness around having those issues not only medically explored, but ultimately legally explored. Now, let me add to that shining example, that doesn't mean that everywhere in the Netherlands, people are always open and celebrating and dancing if there is a transgender person around. I've discovered that as much as anywhere else in the world, there can be transgender discrimination here, as much as anywhere else.
Richard, do you have any questions?
I have to unmute myself. I'm sorry. I had a message from Dr. Duggan. She was trying to get into the conversation, but she was not able to. I don't know what happened. But that last comment that Wilhelmina had made about the transgender discrimination, there as well as in other parts of the world. How is that discrimination not necessarily just towards transgender, but does that discrimination cross a lot of other boundaries? Or is it just specifically that you see focused in toward transgender, or is there a difference between the transgender discrimination and someone who is gay, lesbian, queer questioning?
Okay. I think I see both. There is also gay male discrimination. I think much less discrimination against lesbians, and I think that has to do with the whole male-female status in the world, the status of women in the world, and a whole range of things. I think people often look at the Netherlands and look at Amsterdam, and then you see gay pride and the canal parade and everything, and you think, oh, it's all heaven and light here, but it's not, because then especially gay men have to go to their local towns, live in local towns, and there are incidences of gay male discrimination that occur periodically and regularly. Some of it is influenced by the influx of new migrants that have great difficulty sometimes with the openness of society in the Netherlands. It is like anywhere else, I think, that the larger the city, the more able you are to live in a society where there are more people like you. I think the essential difference is that with transgender people, if you do not, how can I put this? If you don't look the part, people tend to notice much more. And so if you have someone that's maybe just in the process, or someone who is always going to look, who is living as a woman, but has certain traits or body structure or facial structure or whatever that makes them stand out a little in general society, and there are always people who will negatively react to that. And that's actually one of the situations that I have written about over some time, about the issue of authenticity and passing. And it reminded me of, you know, back in the 50s, and I think there were a couple of very strong movies in the 60s in America of people who are black, but who have perhaps are not as black as other people who are black, and are therefore trying to pass as white. And when transgender people transition, do you stay authentic if you say, I am a woman, and you never say you're transgender? Or do you have an internal authenticity that continues to recognize that I will never be a biological female, and my DNA is maybe a little different, my chromosomal makeup is a little different. How do I maintain my own authenticity and dignity within a larger society that perceives me to be a woman? And in that process, where I know that I'm not the same as the women's group that wants me to meet with them, and that I'm not quite comfortable with, because they have different issues than I have sometimes. They have grown up with different issues because they were biological girls from the start, and I was not. And they were anatomical girls from the start, and I was not. And I think that's kind of an interesting issue sometimes to explore, because it is about authenticity and maintaining your authenticity, but at the same time having to live within the bounds of a very complex society sometimes.
Thank you. Excuse me.
And we have this internal argument within transgender groupings sometimes, you know, like, who do you need to tell? Do you need to tell? Especially, you know, if in the Netherlands your birth certificate is completely changed, and in the old register that nobody can see, but you are given a whole new certificate that shows you as female. And so who do you need to tell, and do you ever need to tell? I think there are internal questions that some people live with, and for other people that's not an issue at all, and they don't need to be reminded. There are, I think, tons of people. My neighbourhood, a couple of people know, and the whole neighbourhood doesn't know. And so I'm also not going to tell people because it's not an important issue in my life. So I've lived so long as a woman now, but if somebody says, are you, then I can say, yes, I'm not ashamed of it either. So, and I think that's part of that wholeness process. Like, how does somebody become whole? Is part of that wholeness that you can say who you are and be proud of that, or is that part of something you feel you have to hide? So, yeah.
anything else as like a final wrap-up comment that you feel you might have left out, or something that you would like to share?
I think if you're looking at the issue of care, and I'm now speaking of transgendered persons, because if you're gay or lesbian, you're gay or lesbian. There is nothing, there is no intervention that needs to happen for you to be who you are. There are also, like I said, transgender people who feel they need no medical or surgical intervention to be who they are, and that their body is very private, and they'll share their body in the way that they want to, but they will share their persona in society also in the way that they want to. And if for some people there is a conflict between those two people, that is their own privacy, and that is their own private journey with which they deal. I think for care to be provided for people who really, as transgendered, want to focus on having surgery that provides them with a new anatomy, that what happens in that process is that the focus is not only on moving them through a process that gets them to surgery, but ensuring at the same time that they are becoming whole in every other aspect of their being. And that doesn't also stop at surgery. One of the very important things that I found is that post-surgically, sometimes the first year is the most difficult, and people want to do all kinds of things because they now have a new body, let's put it that way. And instead of taking the time to adjust, secondly, before surgery, ensure that when you're dealing with the whole person, you are also talking about what will you do with your life post-surgery if and when surgery happens. What is your bigger picture for the 20, 30, 40, 50 years after you have surgery? How do you plan to live in the world, and what do you plan to do with your life? What are your goals? And sometimes there is, I don't know how it is now in some places, because of course I'm an old tranny and I'm an old client and I'm post-operative, but sometimes the focus is so much on getting to that surgery that we forget that that is simply a step on a much bigger journey of life. And we've always got to focus on the journey of life.
And I see that Dr. Duggan finally joined us.
Okay.
So it has been a very great conversation. You know, I think that the messages that you've shared have really been beneficial, and I know that many of our social workers from our program here at the Ryan White program will definitely benefit from, you know, listening to the conversation that we've had. And, you know, I know that it is very very important, and, you know, can be put you in a very vulnerable state to share about your own personal struggles with transitioning and things like that. And, you know, you've shared, you know, some very intimate details of your life with us, and we greatly appreciate that. And I don't know if Dr. Duggan would like to say thank you for providing this educational opportunity for the University of Toledo Medical Center. If you can hear me and want to unmute yourself.
Yes, I'd like to say absolutely. Thank you so much for the presentation. Had a little bit of a hard time logging on and staying on due to technical difficulties, but we can't thank you enough.
Thank you. So it's wonderful to be able to share. Yeah.
Well, in doing that too, also, provides education to us so that we can meet people where they are in their own lives, because that's what's most important.
Yeah, I hope this can be a learning experience for all of us. So yeah. So I'm still learning. I'm 74 and I'm still learning, and occasionally I'll write something and think, oh, I'd never thought of that way before, discovering that, I'm now, I guess in the transgender world, I'm the old guard. And there are a couple of people who were very well known in the Netherlands over the years who had surgery in Casablanca in the 60s and 70s, who have died in the last year. And, my idol, Jan Morris, who I think was like 95 when she died last year, was the same age my mother would have been, was somebody who just really was an inspiration whenever I heard her, occasionally spoke with her in seminars and things like that. And we're the old guard. And over the years, there's in many places in the world a new guard, I'm sure in America as well, that has arisen, a younger grouping of people who come with a different perspective. And we older ones, it pays us also to listen to that, to again broaden our perspective as well. So.
Yes, very, very, very true. I will say for the LGBTQ plus community, those things have changed over the last couple of years. And we're getting ready for our Toledo Pride Parade, which is going to be in August. Of course, Pride is usually in June, but this year, as we travel down Adams Street, they have created a new gay pride flag that has the original colors. And then on the corner, there's like a triangle that has lavender and pink and black stripe. So, for me, coming from that late 70s, early 80s, when the gay pride flag was just the what I always refer to as Roy G. Biv. That orange, blue, indigo, and violet. That it kind of shocked me when I drove down Adams Street a couple of weeks ago. I was, I was kind of insulted in one way. And then I had to stop and think about the struggles that these other genders or individuals are going through that, put their, that have that on the flag. So, it is, like you said, that fluidity a little bit more today than what it was. It's not just black and white gender, male, female, or transsexual, there is that fluidity that's going on today. And that really, made me think this evening, as you shared about that, how things are changing. And I'm now 60, and I'm no longer the the young one that was back in the early 70s or the early 80s, I should say.
Well, the interesting thing is, you said about the flags. I was watching a something on the news, I think Sunday evening, and it was a report from something to do with our government, Parliament in The Hague. And where the Parliament buildings are, there is like a huge lake there. And on one edge of the lake, they have flagpoles, and they're always hang all the flags from all the provinces in the Netherlands. But right now, all of those flags are LGBTQ plus flags. And they hang there until I think the end of June now. So yeah. So the government's very supportive of that. It's just a part of what happens in this society. So, yeah.
All right. Well, we're right at an hour. So if there are no other questions or comments from anyone who is on the call, we will, of course, thank you so much for being here this evening and staying up past your bedtime. And you know, the hour difference is you know, quite extensive between here and there. So we do greatly appreciate you sharing. And like James said, this will be, it is being recorded. It's going to be sent out, and people will have the opportunity to view it. And I'm sure that, you know, that we will definitely use this to our best educational potential for our staff, students, and colleagues here at the University of Toledo Medical Center.
Great. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you again.
All right.
All right.
Have a wonderful evening.